Welcome to Discerning the Forms. I'm Nick.
I'm Anthony.
We're glad you're joining us for episode 4.
Episode 4.
That's
where
right.
we're at.
That's right. So we have a really exciting topic tonight. Another, what we've been going through, we've been kind of setting the tone for how we want to kind of approach future topics, really. And so, that's why we really wanted to build a foundation with aesthetics and even tell you about like the apologetics thing. I mean, hey, we're not here necessarily doing apologetics. We're kind of done with that in a way, and we're just kind of moving on.
Yeah.
With like,
well, I think that
it's not that it's, we ended it and be like, it's not that it's not a thing, in the church, but I think that it's not we're just not in that world anymore. We're kind of in this place where now we're wanting to we want to clean our glasses, so to speak, so we can see the world, so we can experience it in a particular way. So not to sound too shady there, but we are gonna talk about some pretty awesome stuff. So Anthony, can I start out reading a Bible passage?
Please.
All right. So my computer was slow and I was trying to get there earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And I might just grab my actual Bible because technology. Okay, so I'm going to turn to Revelation chapter 6. So John is caught up in a vision as he's worshiping. He sees this divine worship service. And during the worship service, the Father holds out his right hand with the scroll with writing on both sides. And one like a lamb slain comes and takes the scroll and begins to open up the seals. And then in chapter 6 it says, "Now I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, 'Come and see.' And I looked, and behold, a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, 'Come and see.' Another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another. And there was given to him a great sword." And I could keep reading, but the point I wanted to make in this introduction is that we need to read the Bible a little, not just the Bible, but our world a little bit more apocalyptically, a little bit more with the sense of the Hebraic worldview and the vision, the imagination of typology and symbol and metaphor and meaning. And so, I don't know, what stands out to you, Anthony, and what are you thinking?
It's funny how you mentioned that you're preaching through Revelation. I'm in a class on Revelation right now, so it's
so interesting.
It's funny, and that this is like our topic, and
it's meant to be.
I think so, providentially, anyways. I think engaging in apocalyptic literature, and in the Bible you have like Ezekiel, you have Daniel, you have obviously the book of Revelation, the first book of Enoch is also considered to be apocalyptic literature, and there's more in the tradition, in the Hebrew tradition. You have more that aren't, I don't think, in like most Protestant, the way that the Bible is for us Protestants. It leaves out apocryphas and a lot of those other ones, which do have this sense of the end of the age is near, and they're sort of anticipating the end of the age. And for Christians, it comes in Jesus. And Paul picks up on this tradition. You see it very heavily in his writing.
What, Paul? Somebody saying that. What, Paul?
I like Paul. Yeah, Paul. Yeah, if you don't like Paul, you don't like Christianity. That's my new motto these days. It's like, I like that guy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But in terms of apocalypse, I think for me, when I first became a Christian, one of the first when I converted, I don't like necessarily using that word, but it's what happened in my life, that God called me out of darkness, and at like around 18. But I remember one of the first verses in the Bible that I read that struck me so deeply was John's first encounter in the first chapter with Jesus, and how he fell at his feet as though dead. And then Jesus says, "Do not be afraid. I'm the first and the last." I remember being so understanding that dread, but then feeling this deep comfort. So in the way that it functions, it's like it sort of opened me up in a way that I wasn't prepared for, which I do think is what apocalypse which is prophetic in its framework.
Yeah. Pastors tell you, "Hey, start in the book of John," or somebody will tell you, "Hey, start at the beginning of the book." But usually Christians, when they first become Christians, read Revelation, right?
That's what I did, 'cause I'm, some smart guy. No, it's funny that Revelation, and I actually had a conversation with a friend at a coffee shop where some people still call it Revelations, and I was like, no, it's John's Apocalypse.
Revelations,
it's the one revelation. It's the singular. It's
that's singular. What, yeah.
Oh, so it's funny how there still is that that language is still out there. So, and I love talking about this. It's probably, I would say, the book of now this podcast isn't about the book of Revelation per se.
No, we should mention that at the beginning. Yeah, we're just trying we're trying to be dramatic or something. I don't know.
yeah. Because it's probably my favorite book in the Bible. If you know me, you would not be surprised by that's like clearly the book that I would choose as my favorite. But I think it does a lot of really great things. And when you sort of deal with, apocalypse generally, you notice, even in culture, before we kind of go a deeper dive here, the way that people understand apocalypse is usually through a cataclysmic event that brings the end of all things, or like some sort of like zombie virus, infestation that creates about the end of civilization. Yeah, pandemic, if you will. And mostly we interpret apocalypse as like this cataclysmic ending event. That's broadly how we think about it.
Do you think
that's not
political thoughts have always been connected with, like, politics have always been connected with that too? I mean, going back to the Reformation, the Pope is the Antichrist, and we've always been, it seems like we've always kind of tied. So what we're teasing out, really, the word apocalypse just means revealed, right?
And unveiling,
revealed, unveiling, and something hidden, something, and in the Hebraic sense, almost this kind of vision of heaven. So we go back to Ezekiel, you go back to the Hebraic literature, is usually a vision that leads to a prophecy that a prophet has to send out, and most of that stuff is unique to Israel and the Hebraic imagination, and so it's kind of hard. It's sort of like in the modern world, scientific. We live in the age of science, and so sci-fi is something unique to our culture. We don't see sci-fi in other cultures. So, so this is a cultural thing. So it's kind of hard, even when scholars try to understand it, or they don't have much to compare it with. They just have the Old Testament books, the Apocrypha, and New Testament
Revelation.
apocalyptic.
Mm-hmm.
Like the book of Revelation. So,
Mm-hmm.
so when we're talking about, when you're talking about apocalyptic stuff and the end of the world or an end of an age,
Or
I
even like
almost see it
post-apocalyptic.
yeah.
That's, we also often think of it as post-apocalypse, and we
Yeah,
see
what
the
happens after
civilization
the
after the
apocalypse?
event, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, after the event, right?
Yeah. Fallout.
Yeah. I think part of what I think I want to tease out in this episode is the importance of just an apocalyptic imagination. Because that's what Paul was under. I think most of Second Temple Judaism is under this apocalyptic framework about the end of the age and the beginning of the new age, and the sort of, again, it has a general sense of pre and post, but the way that it is tied to such a specific identity, and even talking about politics and geopolitics and apocalypse, I mean, that's the whole thing for Israel, is like it's tied to the kingdom of God, which Israel is this chosen people. So there's very, very specific identity notions in an apocalyptic worldview, that God is for these people, for these elect people. Like Enoch has that, a language of election. Israel has that. They're chosen by God, not because of how strong they are, how big they are, but because He loves them. And there's nothing behind that love besides God's full love. So,
it goes back to
love
covenant promises.
Mm-hmm.
In the Old Testament, the Hebrew people saw God as revealing Himself ultimately in names and promises that were kept and revealed. So then, that actually strengthened their faith as a culture. So rather than sort of like having a God that they appease, to keep their crops growing or something, they have this really interesting system where God's kind of already made this relational promise to be with them. And then every time a new kind of covenant or promise is announced, there's a remembering of what God has done in the past. Here's how I saved you this time. So I'm going to save you again, which leads to this kind of, in Christian language, we use the word eschatology, which just means kind of what we think is a culminating history, and which kind of has within it this view of a future of a culminating final whole, just like a tree grows, and at a certain point the tree grows and it's full, and the tree, though it might get new branches or you might have to prune it or whatever, it's full, it's done growing, it has its full shape. There's a sense of where history is going that direction, and so there's things that imagination brings with it, like hope and imagination, and okay, what's God doing right now? Anticipation. It's like we know Christmas is coming. I've asked for these things. I don't know what I'm going to get for Christmas.
Yep. until the apocalypse of Christmas Day. Yeah.
Christmas Day.
Until the eschaton of Christmas morning. I think I also love. Years and years ago, I saw this picture of this guy. I forgot who shared it initially, but it's around Christmas time, and he has a sign. It's in a suit. He says, "The beginning is near." And I kind of loved that, rather than the end is near, it's like the beginning. Jesus is the beginning is coming. The new creation is coming, and so there's a way in which it's like there's a the cataclysmic event of the cross, which is obviously cataclysmic and obviously literally shaped history, right? Like for the longest time we had BC and AD, right? Like those were literally markers of how we measured linear time, was by the event of Jesus, which is, it's so significant. So I think for me, the notion of all those things you just said, they're all so tied to anticipation and a desire for the end, and to be united to the whole, which is Christ, which is the triune God. This is what, Israel is waiting for their, obviously anticipating the figure who's going to come and liberate them from political oppression and slavery from Rome. And who plays this sort of new Babylon role, even in John's imagination in Revelation, right? Like he sees Rome as a Babylon, figure, and the way that he talks about the symbols of Rome, and with Satan as the dragon, and the angels, and so there's all sort of like what I love about even engaging sort of apocalyptic frameworks is like it gives us a vision, it gives us a view of things where we can be helped in discerning, obviously like good from bad, and these sort of different patterns that John sets out in Revelation. He's also working with like Daniel and all the sort of Hebraic tradition in writings and the prophetic, which are apocalyptic because they're an unveiling of who God is and what he's going to do, and the way John even refers to God as the one who was, the one who is, and the one who is to come. There is this sense in which like those are all present in God. You can think of it as triune, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, the sort of eschaton, and the culmination of all things being bound up in Christ and held together. And so to move on here, obviously we think of apocalypse very differently than a lot of the even American evangelical traditions think of apocalypse. They think, you can think of like the Left Behind series as like sort of the major theological,
you think of like
imagination for so many.
There's this kind of sense of the popular literature is all about this kind of end times, final, destruction of everything. Everything gets blown to pieces, and God takes his ball and goes home. And okay, so then, are there different ways to interpret this eschatology? Is there like optimistic and pessimistic forms of hope, or is hope just hope? I mean, am I speaking rhetorically?
I think part of it for me, I think there's obviously different traditions in interpreting the eschaton, right? So you have the different schools of thought where you have like the premillennial rapture oriented.
Now
takes
just so you know, I grew up in a world where I only knew like that there were two positions that existed, and I knew the one that Christians were supposed to be on. So I mean, there might be some people listening who are like, "Whoa, wait a second. There's more views than just like the rapture." I thought there was like, pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib, but like, is there just a whole nother way of looking at it altogether?
Yes, because I think I didn't grow up. I didn't grow up in a Christian home, so for me, like, I have none of this like baggage that people often come to the table with in terms of like whether it's the prophetic imagination, how you like prophecy can be like a vision of the future. They're like a seer almost, like a pagan would have, like, or even like the fortune tellers you have in these crummy shops, like they have like they can give you visions of what the future could be. Like that's, I think, a lot of how people even think about biblical prophecy is like always future oriented, especially when you think about
fortune telling,
the life of fortune. Essentially, they have this sort of pagan fortune telling perspective that I'm like, do you guys realize that's what it is? Because that's not really how it functions in the Bible or any sort of biblical prophet. They're usually critiquing social oppressions of the outcast, the poor, the widow, the orphan. Like this is in the way that society often oppresses those people, and those people get left behind and forgotten, and then God's prophet will come and critique and give and bear judgment upon people for what they've done and what they're doing. But even the way that they, again, going back to Book of Revelation, the way that we interpret it, some people will often take it so literally that they will talk about the numbers. You've seen, I mean, if you've been a Christian for long enough, you'll see these teachers, quote unquote, who have these whiteboards where they put the line of the charts. You have the charts, and you have like they connect all these things, and they're like, it looks like an absolute mess because that's kind of what it is. It's just a mess. They don't take seriously like the Hebraic tradition or the way that it's often usually thought of as, the unveiling of God and who he is and his character. But so you have these different traditions in Christianity that the premillennial, is it post-tribulation? I don't know how. There's all these different
Well, once you
names.
get into that world, and they all fight amongst you. The closer you are in an ideology, the more you fight. But so it's kind of funny. You have people that think the Lord's going to come before a future for them, great tribulation,
Yes.
and then there's some that think, well, no, he's going to come about midway as it's sort of happening, and then there are others that are maybe don't believe in the rapture theory at all, but believe in the second coming, but they're premillennial. So
premillennials is
So when you get into Bible and eschatology, there's a really kind of obscure passage towards the end that kind of references this age of 1,000 years of Christ's rule and reign. And so, again, just because it just mentions it briefly and then moves on, it's created so much debate and interest in the Christian imagination, because they're trying to figure out, what is this age like? Some age of peace and prosperity? Is it the Christian age? Or is it like a literal 1,000 years? How do we take the number? And so there's all sorts of debate in the chart world, so in all the charts.
Yeah.
So
I was never part of the chart world, so I couldn't give you too much information on that or like emotional baggage from it, because I know there are people who can go extremely to the other side because of how poorly exegetical that tradition is.
Well, I say this, that was like the default position for most people. Like, I grew up, evangelical, charismatic, church is sort of like a charismatic, reformed light, church. And actually, I found out at one point when I was studying eschatology in my late teens that my dad was all millennial, but he never made a big deal of that because most of the church was premillennial. That was the default position. Everybody's reading Left Behind. That was huge in the 90s, and everybody
it's an
tried
imagination creator.
And it was one of those things that it did create a lot of trauma, because kids would come home and their parents weren't there, and they'd think everybody went in the rapture except them. Or I know something I struggled with, that once I got out of that worldview, it really helped me. But I never wanted to have kids when we first got married. Like, I wasn't sure whether I'd want to have kids when we were first dating and about to get married, or at least not have kids for long, not have too many kids, that kind of thing.
Right.
And because I'm like, I don't want to bring kids into a world that's blowing up, or just there's weird psychological things that you have when you.
See, I didn't even think of that.
You bring when you have it's kind of like when you have a. It's like if you get cancer and you find out you only have 4 months to live, like everything changes. You reorganize your life in a different way because you no longer have the luxury of time on your hands. So you just kind of do some of the things that you always want, bucket list kind of things. And I think a lot of Christians who adopt this worldview, it kind of shows. Like, I think a lot of the church is weak because they have this kind of bucket list view of the future and kind of global and social imagination. So and they grow to expect it. So when they see crazy things happening in their society or their culture, there's this kind of, well, Lord Jesus, take me now, kind of a feeling. And I don't think that's how John was, or the hearers of this when John's revelation was given and read in the 7 churches. I don't think people were thinking like that. I think they were thinking like, when you see these signs, get the heck out of Jerusalem, because it's going to be destroyed. But
so that gets into dating of the book too, right? The dating of the letter. And,
and
and how that functions for interpretation, but that's not the scope of our podcast today, which I don't feel
Yeah, we're
even
not. I'm
remotely ready
tempted
to do
to, but
that.
I won't get into. I promise.
You broached the subject,
I broke
but
the
I'm gonna
subject.
not.
All we want to do is
Like,
say,
let's
like,
go
wait a
somewhere
second.
else.
Yeah. Well, I think either way, wherever you date it, those early. My point is,
Yep.
the early Christians were not. They were thinking about, kings and rulers and what's happening, and how
Mm-hmm.
Jesus Christ is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So don't put your trust in all
Right.
that junk, and
Yeah.
trust in this organic kingdom. My point in even
Yep.
reading the riders, the horses and the riders, and there's all sorts of different
Mm-hmm.
interpretations with those, but they're
Oh yeah.
definitely something that's geopolitical, having to do with,
It's
famine,
always geopolitical for
wars,
sure. Yeah.
and it's antichrist behavior, because Christ doesn't say we move
Right.
culture that way. He doesn't say we live by the sword. He doesn't say if you want to get things done, you centralize and make everybody do it.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And so I think what you're getting, I was going to remark that, I was going to comment what you're saying about the trauma that you sort of were working with from your tradition. There's an aesthetic there that tradition has to it, right? Like, so it's not just about scripture. It's about an entire imagination about how the world will look, how the world will feel, how you're supposed to live, how you're supposed to be in the world. And that's not, the left behind isn't scripture. Like, it's just not. Like, that's right. Like, it's more than just about what scripture says. So
it's kind of
to
a
me, it's like it
Frankenstein
goes.
of scriptural interpretation.
It's like a mash of different verses, and somehow all these things are supposed to create a coherent whole. Which to me, you're like majoring on the minors, and you're not looking deeper into immediate context and how that can help tease out what actually it maybe means for us. And so, like you said, what was happening for the Christians is like Revelation is speaking to their context. So at least on the ground level of Revelation, John is writing about Rome and the Christians' position within Rome and the church's position within that world. And so this will get into, to me, what the apocalyptic imagination is that what John is ultimately doing is he's trying to show them what the world actually looks like. Off culture, it's painting a world for us, and that's the world we're supposed to hear. Even nowadays, which we were supposed to be rational and scientific, and we go on evidence, and we're very rational. But the reality is, like, the media paints a narrative for us. The government wants us to see a certain thing and believe a certain thing, so it has to create this cohesive picture for us. And you even have rituals involved in public life and symbols like the flag and even, the Twin Towers. Like, these are powerful mythical symbols that shape our hearts and our minds. So the idea that, that you're only open to evidence, and wherever the evidence may lead, that's where I'll be. It's like, you don't actually know how susceptible you are to ritual, because you've said ritual doesn't do anything, right? So you can even interpret the book of Revelation like as liturgical worship, actually. Like, there is like commentaries out there where it's like, this is a liturgy. This isn't just like, right? So it's like,
there's a call to worship
so,
at the beginning, then the 7 churches, you have confession, and then you
yeah, exactly.
The church didn't just develop that for no reason. It grew up organically out of the synagogue and out of John gives you, he tells you, said it's worship on the Lord's Day. It's liturgy. Liturgy is way more powerful than we think to shape life.
We're shaped by it. Yeah.
Why is the military so liturgical?
Especially in Rome, in Roman military, you have literally sacrifice to the different gods before they go to war. And so Christians couldn't really serve in the military because you can't bear false witness and like sacrifice to these different gods, which I would even argue do exist in some capacity, whether they're like the divine beings that are rebelling against God or like demons. Like, this is actually what's happening. So for us now, if we're not aware of the power of ritual and liturgy, we're going to be left like riding a wave, like you see now in the days of, the right and the left in America. They're just riding this wave of like, I have to grab onto something. So this ideology is going to fit me best because I feel most comfortable here. and it both best expresses myself. But the reality is like there's an inherent imagination, ritual, to each side. They have their language, they have their vestments, they have their different priests, they have their different sacraments. Like if we can't start
So
seeing it
unpack
like
that a
that,
little. I mean,
yeah,
somebody's listening and they're like, "Well, wait a second. Like, I thought we got rid of all that stuff. I don't see it.
yeah.
I maybe
I
it's
think
because you're swimming in it, but I
it's
think
hard
people don't
it's like
see it. Yeah,
yeah. No, I think we live in an age where the imagination is about. I mean, we got into this in the last episode about apologetics. It's like
yeah,
each time frame has its own vision of the world, right? So you have uh, in medieval times, you still have a sort of a spiritual cosmology, right? You haven't completely lost the idea of angels and demons and the cosmic hierarchy, the heavens and the earth, and this is sort of the main imagination. But once like the Enlightenment comes, and once like John Locke and Newtonian physics sets in, it completely it casts a blindness over our vision about what reality is. Like I don't want to say disenchant because it didn't disenchant in the way that like it took it out for real. It's more like it put in new rituals and a new imagination for
yeah.
us. So now we see the world as cause and effect, material realities growing out of probabilities, and so for me it comes down to. So when I say like that, the right and the left both have their rituals and their sacraments and their language that they use, they have their religious fervor. I mean, to me, it seems kind of obvious, but I guess for some people who aren't really thinking in that way, it's like a fish who, I think that author, David Foster Wallace, he gave us talk about, he opened up a speech about fishes swimming in water, and a fish remarks about some other water. He's like, "What's water?" Like, so the idea of is like you're swimming in it. It's part of your life. You don't even notice it because it's like water, like a fish in water. It's just the air you breathe per se. So when I
Well,
say like
even
they all have their rituals,
mhm.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, even just to think about how ritual and habit shapes our life. You
Mm-hmm.
know, we moved a couple times. Man, what has it almost been 2 years ago? And we initially moved out of a townhouse into an apartment, and then the house we now purchased. And
Mm-hmm.
it was kind of a crazy year because of moving twice. But I remember getting ready to leave our home, and the one we'd been in, all our kids were born at the hospital, but in the they were raised
Right, but
early
in the
in the
house though, they
home.
were raised in the
They
house.
were,
Yeah.
yeah, weaned in the house, and so we. But I remember just kind of reflecting on this one time that the different rooms, the different spaces that I habitually did this every day, or walked
Mm-hmm.
over here, or the couch that you habitually sit in every evening, when you get home from work, or the path you take up the stairs in your kids' room, and the spaces. So the space and the habits form such memory and meaning that it's almost jarring to leave that. It's almost like
Mm-hmm.
an apocalyptic chaos to
Yeah.
leave that behind and say we're going to be done with that. It's going to be gone, and we're going to have new habits and new spaces. And human beings just can't escape it. It's part of anthropologically, it's part of our
It's hardwired
core.
in.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it's hardwired
hardwired
in.
in. We're liturgical, religious creatures. Even if you
It's
can't, even if you want to get rid of it all, you can't.
yeah. Well, there's a really interesting book by Stephen R. L. Clark, who is a really brilliant philosopher, but he talks about how even if you were to somehow prove that God didn't exist, like the rituals would still be intact. Those would not change. Even if you could like fundamentally prove that like there's no transcendence, he's like, people would still
You'd still have a
pray.
religious calendar. Might
Yeah,
be
you still
Hallmark
have a
calendar,
religious
but
calendar. Yeah, it might be something different, but like it's not he says it's not irrational for somebody who's dying alone in the desert to call for help. That's not irrational, right? That's like an actual proper response to the situation. Even if nobody's there to help, it's still something that we're going to do because of the impulse that's inside us. So I think you're right. Like it's hardwired into us, even if God didn't exist, which is stupid because that's not possible.
Well, can I
But
ask
like,
you this?
yeah,
I'm not trying to delve into politics too quickly, but do you think that's why we see some of the cultural trends today where there's this, some of it I just feel like it's neocons that have moved the Democratic Party that are just, trying to appeal to Gen Z or something. But do you think that
yeah,
they still want, they wish they could be in Afghan. They probably have some other plans right now as of what we speak. We'll probably still be in Afghanistan 20 years from no. So,
I don't know. Yeah,
or fighting things at home, but
right.
domestic terrorism. But do you think that this whole push to kind of restructure like human identity and sexuality and even, cultural social habits, and here I'm not saying whether something's right or wrong, just the fact that there's a push for difference, that, what is the saying then about Christianity? Is it something that, because we want to say that something more than just habit and form, but that that somehow it prevails because it's going with the grain of the universe. Like it's somehow organic, more organic than like if we're gonna try to create a topsy turvy world where X equals Y. So what do you kind of catch what I'm getting at? Just the whole movement of the gender dysphoria of our whole culture. Do you think that there's something with that? What's going on culturally, apocalyptically there, liturgically?
Yeah. Interesting. I think I often refer to Peter Lightheart has I saw him speak here down in Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He and Kevin Van Hooser, just really brilliant guys, had a discussion about the future of the church and what that ultimately will look like. And Peter Lightheart has this, he's very typological in his interpretation of Scripture, which just means there are types, and you can sort of see these types throughout Scripture. Like Moses
which is part of what you
right?
need for an apocalyptic imagination, right?
Exactly. And Peter Lightheart's also commentary on Revelation is something everybody should pick up and read because it's one of the best around, I would say.
I think so,
in my own estimation. But what I would say is that there's a sense of resurrection cultures or kingdoms, or even, you see that in Israel's life where there's like a death and then there's a resurrection of the remnant. I think this pattern works out in the history of kingdoms and nations, and so, but
two philosophers I want to bring out as you're talking about that, and one is Eden Rosenstock Husey, which I'm pretty certain that Lightheart is adopting as
big
at least
time,
a philosophical framework to understand. Rosenstock Husey believed that there are those cycles of death and resurrection just in every, like he could see that everywhere.
Yes, that's where Lightheart got it from.
Yeah. And then Rene Girard, who is getting a lot of attention these days because
rightfully
basically can see, he can see better than any scholar I can even pick up. Yeah. He can see through the crazy politically with mimetic theory and scapegoating and theory of violence and atonement. So, we see those cycles. Keep going. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I would say what I try to do in terms of when I look out into culture and politics is like, you got to learn how to discern patterns in the world, right? And this is to talk about symbolic understanding of the world, which I think that's how we all see the world. It's not by rational structure. It's more like we interpret the world symbolically. And That's the way we understand things and each other, right? Is through various symbols, various myths. Without mythology, you don't have like rationality, I don't think. Like without a mythos about who people are, involves anthropology, like you don't really know how you know anything if you don't have like a mythology around what it means to know in the first place. So what I would say to sort of answer your question in terms of like apocalyptically, there is clearly something going on, right? There's a push for something, and why is that something? So we have to go back to the sort of Christian vision and reality about like, okay, like let's go back to Revelation. Let's think about, what does it mean for us to see the world aright? How do we understand the difference between the light and the dark? And how do we best discern what our place in the world is in that context? And so, in terms of like gender dysphoria and these sort of major pushes for, reshaping humanity, shaping how we view identity,
like
this
post-humanism or something. I don't know.
Right, like like the sort of AI, the push for AI,
Yeah.
and which is, if you've read any sort of
Gnostic.
yeah, it's Gnostic, and it's very much like a problem. So I think without making any moral judgments on culture, which I can make a lot, but I think for the purposes, it's like I want to recognize how I can see God in the midst of it. That's really, really important for us, because I think a lot of times and by seeing God, I just mean like encountering transcendence within the world to help open myself up to that transcendence, which John is doing in Revelation, which also in Daniel and Ezekiel, these visions, while they are wild and beyond anything I've ever experienced in life, what it's doing is like it's giving us a window into the transcendent, that all we see isn't just the material or the rituals that the culture gives to us, but that behind the scenes there is like this cosmic sort of war happening. So for me, like, I don't get too bogged down in trying to find my ideological place in the world right now, because it's so chaotic to begin with, that I have a hard time seeing ideology as any sort of answer at all, because clearly what it's done is like divided and poisoned people to where we can't even love our neighbor well, because we're so informed by whatever political ideological purity you think you need to have. It demonizes the other side. So it's sort of doing this fracturing, which God and like right? So like the Spirit always unites, and in a Christian perspective would always be trying to obviously caring for the poor. This is like the primary role of the church, is to love the widows and the orphans, which is sort of an apocalyptic framework, right? Like you're not swayed by the major rituals of culture. You're swayed by the gospel and the rituals of Christianity, which are loving your neighbor as yourself and loving God and going to worship on Sundays and forgiving people. And so it's all about like discerning the proper pattern of being in the world. And by that is a Christian vision. So if you're not a Christian, my answer is not going to help you at all, because part of it for you is like you have your own rituals if you're not a Christian, and you have to discern, what does that mean for you? But maybe being in the world for some people is the rituals of our culture. Maybe that really is what gives them their full meaning and their full sense of life and connectedness and unity, is by like entering into these communities, whether a Republican or conservative or a leftist liberal. But for a Christian, I don't think you can find those homes. I think those are ultimately distractions from what our true home is. And so you need a sense of a proper critique of the world, which the prophetic word offers, and so does an apocalypse. It's like,
you need some kind of alienation from the things of this world. Not in a sense that like we're critiquing actually is the Gnostic view, but one that is we're more kind of, our distance comes from different distance in age, not as in elderly and younger, but is in the next stage or this age. So we already have our foot in the age of resurrection, one foot in that. I mean, and we're kind of in a time where of the already not yet, where this has there's a lot of tension. And someone that hasn't stepped into that spiritual age, so to speak, of the future. You see, this is really the ultimate thing is Christians, though we're not progressivists, we're not progressivists in the sense that we think the world is sort of marching towards some progressive future. We do believe the world has already been won and the future's already set in place cosmically.
Yeah.
And so Christ has already come and broken in the future's broken into the past in that sense and is present with us now. So we have to kind of disorient our views of future and now. The alienness comes from us just not having a home in this kind of present
we're in
dying
exile
age.
in a way.
Yeah.
Well, I think Richard Bauckham, who I'm going to read here from his book, The Theology of the Book of Revelation, which I think is a really very, very helpful perspective. So I'll read a couple passages, and I think it'll inform even more of what we're talking about. So he talks about how, in the first place, John's work, he's talking about the book of Revelation, is a prophetic apocalypse in that it communicates a disclosure of a transcendent perspective on this world. It is prophetic in the way it addresses a concrete historical situation. So he says that the effect of John's visions, here is this one. But John's work is also apocalyptic, so it's prophetic and apocalyptic. That's what it's doing. He says that because the way that it enables its readers to see their situation with prophetic insight into God's purpose by disclosing the content of a vision which John has taken, as it were, out of this world in order to see it differently. And then here's the main thing here that I want to read is that, so John, he's talking about John's sort of symbols and the images that he's using. He says that the power, the profusion, and the consistency of the symbols have a literary theological purpose. They create a symbolic world which readers can enter so fully that it affects them and changes their perception of the world. So that's what I'm saying that we need as Christians, and especially in this concrete situation, is we need to have our vision changed and affected by the word, right? By God, not by whatever political philosophers we like, which I think are helpful and can inform, a proper interpretation of times and of, predicting failures of maybe foreign policy, for example.
There's a use for it, but
there's a use for it. But ultimately, we need to be driven by this specific vision of God's breaking in, the transcendent breaking into the concrete here, that all that there isn't just this stuff, that there is much more major things at play, and that without going too far afield, like some things have happened with Christian traditions where they go so far, like you said, like you don't even want to bring kids into the world because of how you think the collapse is coming, right?
Right.
And there's always talk about collapse. There's always talking about like, this is the end, this is it. But like, how often has maybe the end was Jesus, and now we're in this different age, right? Like, it's not necessarily a matter of chronological end in the sense that
new beginning and the culmination of that. Yeah.
And culmination and redemption and like participation in God's redeeming of the world and his people, right? And this is a part of the process, is like death and resurrection until the final death, as it talks about, John talks about, like the second death for Satan and his angels. But so this is sort of what Baukham's getting at, is what I think we want to express more fully. And, especially when we're, so just a little teaser, our next episode is going to be on politics, and we're going to try and do that differently than maybe other people try to do political commentary, because we're going to talk more broadly and bigger picture kind of stuff, including moving from an apocalyptic framework. Because I think if you don't have this frame, you're overly obsessed about like pragmatics and policy and the right person in the right office. And
so if we just get the right guy up there, or we just rationally define the specific situation good enough, then finally the end will come. But what is that Messiah we're replacing?
Right.
Yeah, it's that
Right. So this is
rationalism.
what I mean by
Yeah,
ritual and
legal
anticipation. So there
systems.
is a frame.
Yeah,
Yeah, like the whole Messiah anticipation of modern American political discourse is like, well, Trump is literally Hitler. He's the worst thing that's ever happened. At least that's what we heard from the left for
right, and
many,
vice
many years.
versa. Yeah.
And vice versa now with Biden. He's the
Mm-hmm.
worst thing that's ever happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when I would be like, I think every president's been really bad, and there hasn't been necessarily a good one. Like, there's been good moments in
Right.
history, but like ultimately, like if you think that getting the right person, like the one right specific or two right people in that position, will change the things the way you want, you're sort of deluded into you're not be able to recognize the bigger powers that are at play for those people to get in office in the first place.
Yeah.
And the rituals that that have been set upon you, that have been pushed on you, whether it's like the political campaign rituals, if you go to speak and it's like these great rallies, like it's like a worship service, right? Like there's a sense in which it's like exuberant, and you have music
It
and you
is.
have big crowds of people. It's very
I
obvious to
feel
me
like
that
we're
like
even modeling our church worship services like that. Like people want it to
they
be
are.
a pastor who does a
Yes.
political rally
Right.
and
And some
with a
churches have some.
band and a yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, people the way that some churches will often hang a lot of American flags at the front of the sanctuary with the cross. It's like
Yeah, so
there's
strange.
yeah, it's very strange, and there could be a confusion of the two. There could be,
Mm-hmm.
or it just could be the manifestation of how people have so interwoven this version of Christianity with Americanism that you confuse the two, and that you aren't to sort of undo those threads becomes very, very difficult work, because when you're critiquing one thing, you're essentially critiquing the other. So then they could interpret you as critiquing America as like, oh, you're anti-Christian. It's like, no, like that's not really what it is. So we have been bamboozled by rituals so much that it's hard for us to really see straight. And that's another thing why I'm trying
Yeah.
to say like an apocalyptic framework is a liturgical framework. It's a recognition of like we are liturgical animals, as Jamie Smith would say,
Yes.
and that we are shaped by these rituals. And you could even say like COVID itself, to bring something more specific, like it has its own sense of rituals and vestments,
Clean and
and
unclean laws.
clean, unclean. You have clean, unclean clause, right? You have all these things that are being rehearsed. It's like as somehow it's just scientific. But if you really only think it's just about science, again, you're being bamboozled, and you're being shaped to see the world in a certain way and people in a certain way.
And
And I'm
science
not
in a
going to,
certain way.
yeah,
Like that it
and science
somehow
in a
has
certain.
to be subsidized by big pharma or something. You know what I mean? Which
So yeah, like again, like I'm not going to make right now a judgment upon like what's right and wrong. I just want
yeah.
people to see that like it's a deeper reality than just it's just a mask. It's like, well, no, like obviously there's clearly something more going on, or if like it's just a vaccine, or it's just
Mm-hmm.
it's just 3 weeks to flatten the curve, or it's
Mm-hmm.
just a lockdown for a certain time. It's like I think you need to go dig a little deeper, because obviously there's more at work here than just. Yeah, I'm not trying to be conspiratorial. I'm just saying liturgy and habits shape and form people, and
Yeah,
we've
whatever
been.
you think of that's shaping you and forming you in this moment, and it's giving you
It
a
is.
religious experience, an encounter with the
It
world, and the
is.
way you think that encounter will bring fulfillment and
Yeah.
satisfaction and so forth.
Right. So even think about like the vaccine is like at one point it's absolution for your sins of
It's like a
being.
baptism, entry and exit into
Yep.
yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
It's the supper. It's the Eucharist for
Yeah.
the body, and it creates a new person, because now that you're
Yeah.
vaccinated,
First,
right?
I thought it was going to be baptism, like an initiation. Now I think it's with all the booster shots. It's probably going to be more like the
Again,
Eucharist.
it might be more Eucharistic in its outlook. Again, not to get into these right or wrong categories, but it's more just
You're not supposed to discern what we think yet. It's just
no. It's impossible for me not to be honest about stuff. But I think the point is like clearly these are rituals, and rituals mean a lot. They mean more often than anything else, because it guides our loves and our desires and what we want for the world and what we want for our neighbor, right? So the impulse, like, let's do something positive, like the impulse that a lot of people have, which I don't think a lot of people are inherently evil about their intentions about getting the vaccine, wearing your mask, because they're trying to like think about your neighbor, and you're trying to think about the world as a whole to make sure that we can get back to some sense of life, right? So there is people who have this imagination about it, and they're not like trying to unnecessarily oppress people or turn things into tyranny because they really want people to be safe and it matters, which I agree. Like I'd agree insofar as we do need to love and care for our neighbor, and we do have to respect each other, and
Absolutely.
we do have to have certain rituals in place in our culture to keep each other safe, to have decorum, right? These things are very important, but at some point we lose the sense of what it's actually about, and then it becomes about something very different along the line. And how you get there is through ritual, it's through symbol, it's through myth, right? It's through mythology, it's through a whole host of things that are aesthetic and not rational in the sense of like propositions, right? The way that advertising works on you, which, you know, the big pharmaceutical companies spend $5 billion a year on advertising. I'll just tease that out there a little bit. But
just a good fact to know as you're thinking through it.
It's a really good fact to know that how much they spend on advertising and the boards they are on these major news outlets. That aside, advertising works on gut level. It doesn't work on a rational, here's my argument for why you should buy my product. It taps into your deepest sense of longing and meaning. I mean, there's times when you watch commercials, it's like, what are they selling? Like, you're talking about my family and safety and like my love. It's like, oh, you're selling, you know, vitamin pills or something. Like, it's
right.
They try to get you on a very deep level that's aesthetic, that it works on you when you're not realizing it.
Right. Yeah. It's Jonathan Haidt, psychologist, probably a lot of people are familiar with, maybe. I am
anyways, but yeah.
You're familiar with him. He makes a point where our reason, actually this is even more just a Heideggerian point, but that our reason and rationality kind of comes in post. We have the structure and the feelings, and it's not the tail that wags the dog, you know, that kind of thing. Right. Yeah. So there's a sense of where our reason is kind of coming in post processing, or I think maybe more in a Heideggerian way, that you don't think about opening the door until all of a sudden you discover the door is locked, and then all your reasoning processes kick in.
Yeah.
And so syllogism and rationality and process is when we kind of take a step into an issue or problem or something, but all of the grammar and the story is already baked into that. I mean, so then you're just kind of analyzing it. It's like taking a book that you've read and then taking a step back and thinking about all the parts of that book and how they connect. And so if we all of a sudden think we can just not read books anymore and just kind of run through those algorithms, that's not going to make any sense. And I'm not sure if that's a good picture of the way people are doing it, but I think that sometimes we're so focused on, if I just get the right principles of economics and issues related to violence and stuff, if I just work those out and knead those out into coherent, presentable, persuasive, that there's some rhetoric there, but a system,
of course,
then you will see, then you will just see, and you'll understand, rather than
you'll get it, then
you'll finally get it.
Yeah.
But for some people that means like uprooting all their lives, their behavior, their social standing, their wealth, so these are things that maybe only some people can see, like John, who's stuck in the island of Patmos and can see a vision and is part of, but someone who's in the Senate can't see in Rome, so I think that this is
vantage matters.
Vantage matters. Convention matter. I mean, it's so crazy. You bring in all these things, and we're not saying you reduce things to that, but those things matter just as much as the rational processes that go into kind of putting it all together once you got to reason your way through it.
I would even, it's possible to say that they matter even more.
Yeah,
than rational processes. You know what I mean? Like, what informs
Totally.
a rational process, right? Like those deep things that are there. Like, to me, somebody can try to argue me all day long, but it's you think about that with anybody. It's like nobody comes to a debate between two different sides and expect to be changed.
Even a scientist who says,
"Yeah." Even a scientist, I'm open.
I took
like,
this.
No,
this was a course that I took in school, and this is a textbook that I had to read, and I know it. So, or I want this to be. You think Galileo, when he was discovering things, he had to be in a certain situation. It's not like he had just this wide open mind. He's already into the literature that's been discussed and working through the experiments and so forth. We come into context, and we just can't divorce. We can't get out of our own skin to...
And thus the importance of apocalypse.
Absolutely.
Right?
So if we have that in our imagination, if we're dreamers... If we still have dreams, we still tell stories, we still envision a future, and are placing some kind of hope on a central messianic idea or figure, it's just going to happen. It's human nature, so you might as well start thinking about it now and decide where you're going to be on an issue. But are you...
Do you ever see the first season of True Detective?
No,
You ever watch that show?
No, I don't think so.
Anybody
I'm gonna go look it up now.
He's gonna laugh. You should watch it. It's incredible. But there's a part where Matthew McConaughey's character goes, "I don't sleep, man. I just dream."
That's so good.
Like, here's
That's our motto here. We don't sleep, we dream.
We just dream, man. Yeah. Even though I sleep pretty heavily and I don't dream a lot, like in terms of like my actual dreams, like I don't remember them very well for some reason. I don't know if it's just like a genetic thing or. I don't remember anything. Like I'll remember them. Like if I have one just before I'm waking up, I'll like remember it for like 10 minutes and then I'll forget. But we all have visions and dreams, whether or not they're like from sleeping or like in our hearts and our minds and our imaginations. We all have visions, right? So it's not a.
Yeah, we don't sleep. We just dream, and that's our motto just here.
Dream, dude.
Yeah. Well, hey, if you like this. Like it, subscribe to it. If you're on one of the platforms we're posting it on that happens to give crypto, I think Odyssey, hey, give us some. Anything else?
We can keep doing this more for longer. No, I would say now the next episode's going to be about politics.
Politics.
So we're going to move from this apocalyptic frame about you're always in your context, but you need to be shaken out of it so you can see it right? Like, that's the point of apocalypse. So when we talk about politics, it's not. I don't know if it's going to be so much about what party you should choose, or
yeah, that's not what we're here to promote.
Yeah. No, we're going to go. We're going to go a little more.
We're off the radar here. We're flying high. So
reservation, man. Yeah, we're off the reservation in regards to politics. Yeah. So I think we're going to higher level.
We've exited the system. So
hopefully,
you all just have to fend for yourselves.
Just I'm aware of the sensitivity of the political realm,
right?
And I don't think we're going to be at least insofar as
we might have a guest with an opinion. Maybe we'll think of a good guest with an opinion.
Yeah, we can kind of riff off that.
Yeah.
Or but ultimately I think what you're going to find here is like we're going to try and help you at least give you a framework to where you don't have to feel so boxed in by the broader culture that you have to be a Republican or you have to be a liberal or something. Like, there's a deeper reality where Christians can settle in because we are.
It's funny that you say Republican and liberal rather than Republican Democrat, because that.
Yeah, it's true. Sorry. Democrat, whatever. No, you're right. Liberal's a philosophical position. Democrat is the party.
Right.
I'm sorry. I'm speaking out of turn. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think I think it'll be interesting. We'll have Freudian slips is what we'll have for you.
We've already been having it this
I
episode.
think so.
So many Freudian slips, man.
We haven't. Yeah. No.
And I don't like Freud, so it's frustrating
Right.
for me because I don't like that guy.
I know. Yep.
But
All right. Well, thanks again. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Remember, what is the motto?
we don't sleep.
We don't
just
sleep.
dream.
We dream.
See ya.
See ya.